This is the chapter 10 of the Real Estate Finance Investing. And here we're going to talk about the valuation of income properties. We're going to talk about appraisal and the market for capital, and we're going to start valuing income properties. First, I want a little discussion on market value. To be able to appraise, we want to be able to say that we actually got the market value of a comparable property. So what you'd like when you look at that comparable property, so you got the true market value, is to say that both the buyer and the seller were motivated, meaning that the seller didn't just put the property on, saying, well, if I sell it, but I don't really care, and they hold it at an inflated price, or that the buyer is not making just lowball offers, not really caring that much if he buys it or not. That both the buyer and the seller are informed, so they don't either under or overpay. That there's a reasonable time period. And that would be focusing on what the average time period for property to turnover is. So if currently it's 8 months on the market, is how long it takes to sell, say, an office property, then that's how you would judge. So if a property's been on much more than 8 months, on 2 years, then you'd say, wow, it's been on way longer than everyone else. If it sells in a week, and most properties are taking 8 months, you might say that property was underpriced. Okay. The payment is in cash or a cash equivalent. The cash equivalent would be a loan, so that's fine that it's a loan. But what they're really looking for here is that there's no special financing. Okay, that there was no buyer, a buy down or something that really would say, okay, we're going to give you some special financing, which actually lowers the value of the property. So the property actually sells for, $1 million, but after the special financing really was only worth $900,000. So we try to avoid those when we're using the market value. Then we have the appraisal process, which in some ways is similar to the residential, but tends to be a little more in depth. First, you'd have to identify the physical and legal identification of the property. Then we have to identify the property rights. Now, this is much more involved, or can be much more involved than the residential. And let's say we're looking at a mall. We'd have to understand all the different leases that all the different tenants had in the mall. So when could they renew? Could they move? What kind of things could they do in the mall? What were their rights? Could they make things? Could they just sell things? Were there things they could sell? Were their leases increasing? Did they have steps in them? Did they have expense stops, and so forth? Then we'd have to have the purpose of the appraisal. You might think, well, isn't that just for sale? But not always. When I worked for John Hancock Properties, for example, we valued all the properties at least every other year, some of them larger ones every year, so that we could come up with a market value of the portfolios for our investors. We couldn't just, like a stock portfolio, go online or look in the Wall Street Journal and get the prices of the stocks. We would have to get appraisals. So every quarter we'd value, an eighth to a quarter of all the properties that we owned. Then obviously we need to have the date of the appraisal, and then we'd apply the specific techniques. So there are three approaches for appraisals. There's the sales comparison approach, the income capitalization approach, and then there's also the cost approach. Our major focus is going to be on the income approach, which you see here in this slide. The sales comparison approach is very similar to what we would have looked at with the residential. You're going to look at a comparable property, and then in the ways they differ, you're going to add or subtract value. And the cost approach is very similar to what we looked at with residential. Looking at the property, say, what would it cost us to buy this land and rebuild the property on this, and then reduce it for physical deterioration, functional obsolescence, and external obsolescence. So those would be the other two. But our focus is going to be on income capitalization approach. And we're going to look at three ways that we could use this approach, the gross income multiplier, the direct capitalization method, and the discounted present value method. These first two methods, the gross income and the direct capitalization methods, rely on current market transactions. Okay? So in both these cases, we're doing them as some kind of a multiple of either, in the first case, the gross income multiplier, or in the second case, with the direct capitalization, some multiplier of the NOI, the net operating income. Okay. So we're going to look at properties that are similar, that have sold in the past, and say, what was, how many times their gross income did they sell? And then use that number we come up with and use that on our current gross income. And with the direct capitalization model, we're going to do a similar approach, coming up with a cap rate based off NOI and the actual sales price. Okay. The last approach, the discounted cash flow, doesn't rely on current market conditions. It does to a degree, but not on the actual sales themselves. It relies on the cash flow that's coming from the property. So you would rely, when I say not completely on current market conditions, is you do rely on the market conditions of the leases themselves, because you have to project what the cash flows would be. So before we can work with all these income numbers, we need to make sure we understand the definitions. So we have the potential gross income, and that would be the income if we had no vacancy at all. So if everything was in the building was fully leased, we'd have the potential gross income. Then we would subtract off if we had any vacancies or concessions, and we'd get the effective gross income. Okay, that would be based on your occupied space, and you'd take out your operating expenses, and you would come up with your NOI, or your net operating income. Okay, the gross income multiplier is sales price divided by your gross income. Okay, so some appraisers will use the potential, and some will use the effective here. We could use one or the other. So let's look at an example here. Let's say that we come up with the sales price, and then we come up with the current gross income, okay, for three properties that are very comparable. And we see that we get for the first property 6.12, the second one 6.15, and the third one 5.99. So we could say, about 6, being conservative, about 6 times their gross income is what these three properties sold at. So we could say, well, then for this property, we'd have $36,000 is their gross income. So we'd take 6 times the $36,000 and say this property should sell for about $216,000. Okay? Now this is based directly off past sales that are comparable. With the capitalization method, we're going to take the NOI from the first year, okay, or the next year's NOI, divided by the value that the property sold for. So we're going to, again, look for comparable sales, then find out what was their NOI that next coming year, divide that by the sales price that they got, and we're going to get an estimate of R. That's the capitalization rate. So we'll again do this for a few and take some average of that. And then we're going to take this R and divide it into our own, the subject properties, NOI, and that should give us the value of the property. Okay, oftentimes this is called the going-in rate, going-in cap rate, and this method is sometimes called the market extraction method. Now we said that we get the NOI by starting with the effective. We get the potential, take out your vacancy, you get your effective gross income, and you take out your operating expenses. I want to make sure that we understand what the operating expenses are, and you'll see them listed here: real estate taxes, insurance, utilities, repair and maintenance, administration, management, leasing, salaries, reserves, and other. The big one here that tends to differ from one appraisal to the next, or one sale to the next, is the reserves. And it sometimes is a big number, sometimes it's not. But when you have major capital expenditures that you think are going to, be very large and affects the value for about 3 years, something like replacing all the windows in the building, replacing an elevator, replacing the driveway, the pavement, the parking lot, things like that, large aspects that will take a long time to do and add value to the property. We call those the reserves. And I have seen appraisals where the NOI does include, the expense reserves, and sometimes it doesn't. So as long as you know in your comparables that they're doing the same thing you are, then you'd be fine. Now the discounted present value method. So in this case, we need to come up with a discount rate. Okay, and generally with real estate, it's somewhere above the corporate bond rate, but below a common stock rate. Okay, when I worked for John Hancock Properties, again, we, for real estate, would use about 4% over the Treasury, which did bring you right in between the corporate bond and above the corporate bond, above the mortgage loans we were doing, but below our common stocks. Then we'd look over a time period. Most of ours, I'd say 95% of our appraisals, were done for 10-year periods. Occasionally, when we knew we were going to probably keep a property shorter, we would do a 5-year. I don't think we ever did 7, but there could be a possible reason if we knew we were aiming at 7 years or big lease turning over at that point that we'd look at 7. Then we'd forecast our NOI. So do an analysis of the leases, the marketplace, and so forth, and forecast the NOI. We'd have to make some kind of an estimate for the reversion value. That's the reversion value is the sales price at the end of this time period. So say, well, here's all the cash flow we're going to get, say, for 10 years. And then what would we be able to sell the property for at 10 years? And then take all those cash flows and discount them back at the discount rate, the required return for your real estate property. If we look at the simplest method or idea, that what if it was a present value of an increasing annuity? So we say we have some kind of NOI right now, and we expect that NOI to increase steadily at X percent forever. Okay, so it's a steadily increasing annuity forever. Well, if you think about this, this is really what we did with stocks when we said we had the constant growth rate. If we had one dividend, and we'd say, well, that dividend's going to just grow at a constant growth rate, we'd say, well, the value of that stock right now is equal to next year's dividend divided by the required return minus the growth rate. That's exactly what we're going to see works here. We're saying the value of the real estate is equal to the NOI next year divided by the discount rate minus the growth. Okay, so the NOI is the net operating income in the first year of ownership. The discount rate is the required return, and the growth rate is the expected growth that will be constant throughout the life. If we look at an example of this, it is an apartment building expected to generate NOI of $100,000 the first year, and rent and expenses are expected to grow at 2% until it's sold after 5 years. At that point, they expect that the property is expected to increase with income, and investors require a 12% return. Okay, what's the value? What's the value of this property? We'd say, well, it's just $100,000 that it's going to get at the end of every year, divided by, the end of the next year, divided by the required return 12 minus the growth rate of 2, and we'd get $1 million. Okay. I want to kind of review this capitalization rate because we're going to use that for the reversion, as you saw we did in the last problem. Okay, as we said, well, if you look down at the bottom, 2 ways to think about the cap rate. One is what we just did. The cap rate was really the discount rate minus the growth rate. Okay, because that's how we got the NOI. We got the value by taking the NOI divided by the discount rate minus the growth rate. But we thought how we did it when we looked with the cap rate, we had the NOI divided by the reversion rate gave us the sales price. So we see in that case, then the reversion rate, the cap rate, is equal to, if you have a consideration of a constant growth, the reversion rate would be, the cap rate would be equal to the discount rate minus the growth rate. So if we go beyond the simple formula, so this is really kind of like a variable growth pricing of stocks that we did in your earlier courses. So what we need to do is project the NOI for each year of the holding period, and then project the resale value at the end of the holding period, and then discount the NOI and the resale value to get the present value. So let's look at an example. Let's say that the income is expected to be $100,000 per year for the next 5 years due to existing leases. So there's leases that are locked in, they can't increase, and they're just going to be $100,000. Then starting in year 6, we now have those leases turning over. We assume we're going to be able to bring it up to a market rate of $120,000. And then due to lease rollovers, we're also going to have an increase of 2% a year after that. And we say investors want a 12% return. So what's the value? So I've drawn in a timeline at the top, and you see there's a $100,000 cash flow per year for the first 5. And then in the 6th year, the cash flow goes to $120,000. And at that point, that $120,000 has a constant growth. A constant growth is 2%. So we could say if we take the NOI in the 6th year and divide it by the required return minus the constant growth rate, that would give us the value of all the cash flows from the 6th year on at time 5. Right? So we got the value at time 5 of those cash flows. So now we have all the cash flows that we actually expect through years 1 through 5, and then we also have at time 5 the present value of all the future cash flows. Let's put that together on the next page. So again, we can find that reversion value by taking the 120 divided by the required return of 12 minus the growth rate of 2, and we come up with 1.2 million. And we say, well, now we just have to find the present value of these cash flows. So we could say, it really looks like a bond. We could say our payment is 100,000, our future value is 1.2 million, and is 5. The interest rate, the required return we need is 12%, and we can just compute the present value, and it comes out to be, you'll see that bottom number down there, $1,041,390. Okay? And if we were using that number to say, well, what's the going-in cap rate, the capitalization amount on this property, I would say, well, it's next year's NOI, $100,000, divided by the value of the property, the $1,041,390, which is 9.6%. Okay? And you see that that is slightly less than the terminal cap rate, which we had at the top of this slide, of 10%. And we'll see that generally that is the relationship, that the going-in rate is slightly below the terminal cap rate. Because what we find over time is that the properties deteriorate and tend to not be able to bring back quite as much income without putting some more money into them. And so without putting more money into them, which we don't see in this example, then we would expect the income to go down a little, so we have to increase our cap. And here's another look at this same problem. $100,000 at the end of every year, and then 1.2 in the 5th year, and then you just find the present value of these cash flows. So we could find the reversion value or the sales value at the end of the time period, as we just did, looking at the long-term cash flows and saying, well, at a certain point in time, so say the NOI at time 10, then we have a constant growth. So we divide that by the required return minus the growth rate, and that would give us what the property was worth, the reversion amount at time 9. And then we need to discount that back 9 years to find what today's value is of that. Or we could look directly from sales transactions. So say we were looking 10 years out. Well, we could look at sales that were similar to our property, but if our property was 10 years old, we might be looking at properties that we're selling that were 20 years old. So they're selling today, but they're 10 years older, and then say what was their going-in cap rate, and we could use that as our terminal cap rate. Or we could just have our resale value based off expected changes in property. So we could just say, well, we expect the property will go up 25% in the next 10 years, and just use that. One other area we'll look at is how to value the property using the debt and the equity components. As we could say that the value of a property is worth the amount of the debt plus the equity investment. So you have to just define a couple of things here. So the debt service will be defined as next year's NOI divided by the debt coverage ratio. Okay, so the debt coverage ratio, if you rearrange that formula, is equal to the NOI divided by the debt service. So how much more NOI do we have than the debt service number? Now we have to use the debt service number to calculate what the value of the mortgage is. And then we also calculate what the value of the equity is by coming up with the present value of all the after-debt cash flows. And then we'd add the value of the debt plus the value of equity to get the present value of the property. Let's look at an example. Okay, in this example, we're given that, and this is an example right out of the book, that the NOI is $50,000, the debt coverage ratio is 1.2, the debt is at 11% for 20 years, and the NOI will increase at 3%. The resale value is determined with a terminal cap of 11 on the 6 years NOI, and equity investors require 12%. And you expect to hold the property for 5 years. Okay, so we're going to need the debt service. So again, the debt service is the NOI divided by the debt coverage ratio, which we were giving was 1.2. So we come up with debt service of $41,667. That's the annual debt service. So we'd say, well, what was the monthly payment? So you just divide that number by 12. Okay, and that would be $3,472.22. Okay, now we're going to need the balance of the loan today because we're going to have to use that amount to add to the equity value to get the total value of the property. So find out the value of the loan today would be the payment, $3,472.22. The interest rate, the required return is 11%, so 11 divided by 12 because we're doing monthly, for 20 years, so 12 times 20 is your N, and the future value is 0, and you compute the present value. And you see that the present value of that loan right now at the beginning of this transaction will be $336,394. Okay. And we also need to know what the balance of this loan is at the end of 5 years because we're saying we're going to sell the property in 5 years. So same process, still solving for the present value, but now we have same payment, same interest rate, but now we only have N equals 12 times 15. Okay, because it'll only be 15 years left because 5 will have already been used up. And we do that. We see the value of the loan at the end of year 5 is $305,493. Okay, now we need to develop our cash flows. So the NOI this first year is $50,000. We increase that by the 3% they told us to. Then we need to subtract out our debt service, which we figured the annual debt service. We did that from the NOI divided by the debt coverage ratio, so the $50,000 divided by the 1.2. That's $41,667. This is a fixed mortgage, so it stays the same all the way across. We then just subtract that debt service from the NOI, okay, and we get the cash flow for the first 5 years. Now we're assuming we're going to sell it in the 6th year, so we get the NOI for the 6th year, and we divide that by the cap rate. So we had the $57,964 divided by the 0.12, and that gives us a value of $526,945. Okay, to get the after-debt cash flow there, we have to pay back the mortgage, and we saw the balance from the last slide was $305,495. Okay, which left us with cash flow in that 5th year of the $221,450 plus the cash flow itself from the NOI after debt of $14,608. Okay, leaving us with a total in the 5th year of $236,058. Okay, so each of those cash flows would be entered into the cash you calculated one at a time. Yeah, cash flow time 1, 8,333 for one period. Cash flow time 2, and so forth. And when we add up the cash flows at, I should say we add them up, when we find the present value of the cash flows at 12%, we get 165,566. We add that to the 300 and some odd thousand, what was it? 336,394 that the mortgage was, the zero balance at the balance at time zero, and we get a value for this property of 105,960. And just one couple last comments on these cap rates and market conditions, in that if we have lower cap rates, will result in higher property values. So if we have, unanticipated increases in demand, then we would expect to have lower cap rates. Higher cap rates will result in lower property values. So an unanticipated increase in supply would get us the demand there. And the unanticipated increase in interest rates would again affect us with lower property values or higher cap rates. Okay, so